All right, welcome, Storm. Faerywolf.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
In my opinion, it was a long time coming, but for you, it was just some weirdo DMing you on Instagram.
That's how it always works, and that's
Yeah.
fine. And that's one of the things that I actually love about the internet is we can make these connections. Sure, there's enough on the internet to not love, but that's one of the things that I absolutely do love the internet for. So I'm glad you reached out, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I would have caught your lecture at PantheaCon, but I was literally I was late to my own lecture because I couldn't find my way around. That place was so huge, like, and how many thousands of people were there. Like, I was fashionably late to my lecture, walked in, slammed down my notes, and just let it rip for an hour and a half. And fortunately, I did very well. It's weird,
Nice.
crazy to be lecturing. I'm 40. I guess I was just before I turned 40. About the Golden Dawn, and with Mary K. Greer in front of me, who wrote like Women of the Golden Dawn. That was like that was like a moment of my lifetime, right? Like, because I stayed home from school in Vienna in '97 just to finish that book, pretending to be sick, and then to be at
And then there she
PantheaCon,
is.
and all this stuff's going around, and hanging out with Chick Cicero and seeing Matt and Devin, but I missed you.
Mm-hmm.
So you're here now. I caught you with my
Here
Zoom
I
net.
am.
Yeah.
There we go. Absolutely. Thank you, Zoom.
The fairy tradition is something you and I share in common because of my love and a lifelong devotion to W.B. Yeats's sort of Celtic stuff in the Celtic Mysteries that he was doing in as a sort of fusion Golden Dawn style order that he never finished. But my first magic book in the occult was when I was like, I think 13, and it was R.J. Stewart's Celtic Magic. So there's this deep thing, like, Wicca sort of brought me to Catholicism and a very different path in life than I started reading Scott Cunningham. But this sort of Celtic the fairy tradition, and especially my years in Ireland and everything I learned there. That's something that's a common stream through some of the most interesting and hardcore craft practices, like the ones tradition you come from, but also weaves through like the Golden Dawn and these other groups as well. So it's the fairy tradition, I think, is just something that is sort of transcendently ecstatic in the magical culture. So thanks very much for being here. This, for people watching, this is the book I'm going to mostly be talking about of his. It's not his beginner book, but and it's not the next two. It's this one.
It's that one. That's the one. That's the one that's actually gotten more exposure, I guess, and I can imagine that part of it is because it is kind of the darker side, of fairy, and of our spiritual practice, and there is where I talk about like the act of cursing in witchcraft. I talk about divine possession, some of the things that some people might consider to be quote unquote scary. And of course, the minute something is marketed as scary, or even the title, Forbidden Mysteries of Faery Witchcraft, it's kind of that velvet rope, right? And then people are like, oh, it's forbidden. Oh, I have to have it, right? So on one level, that's like the marketing part of it. But yet it's true because it's all about the shadow. And there is something about, it is scary because all the things that scare us, we kind of, that really scare us, not the things that are fun to be scared about, but the things that actually scare us, we don't look at, and so that goes into that shadow, right? And so this particular book is really about working through the shadow, but in a way that incorporates a fairy mysticism, and at least my particular take on it, because I don't claim to be an academic, and I don't claim to be certainly not a scholar or even a traditionalist, in the sense of like the Celtic, emanations and histories, of fairy. Those are the roots, for what I do. But I'm largely informed through what some people might call the Anderson fairy tradition, which is an initiatic path of American witchcraft. But it takes those roots from Celtic cultures and honestly many other cultures as well, and kind of uses those to inform our practice. And that tends to be, that's the main impetus, I would say, of my work, really stems from the Anderson, fairy tradition. So that's going to look different than, maybe other fairy authors that are working much more closely with, this is what the folklore says. Although obviously you see in that particular book, I do bring in some very specific pieces of traditional folklore that really have spoken to me over the years, like, Thomas the Rhymer and, and so on and so forth.
Tamlin.
Yeah, absolutely.
First let pass the black lady and soon let pass the brown. Yeah, we're going to have some fun in this conversation.
Nice.
Yeah, I want to do a whole little segment on ballads and balladry, and maybe talk about some of your choices that I really enjoyed. I compared the Thomas the Rhymer with some of the original ones from the Child's Book of Ballads, which I've been obsessed with since I was 13, 14.
Nice. Very good.
So you can see why I'm so excited to talk to you, right? Because you're literally doing what I love.
I hope it doesn't disappoint, so,
no, I
a
love
lot
your
of the stuff I do is just like, this is how I feel about it. And so I don't know if it's right, but this is what's right for me. And that's what I share with the world is, this is what I've worked with. This is my own gnosis, and here you go. Hopefully it's useful, right, for somebody else. But
the Pantheon of Gods you work with in this book in particular, is that particular to your Black Rose stream of the lineage, or are those gods common to the whole fairy tradition of the Andersons?
So that wouldn't be common to Black Rose. Black Rose is kind of its own thing.
Oh, yours is Blue Rose.
So Blue Rose, so it's going to be confusing, right? Because they're both ours. So Blue Rose is my lineage of the fairy tradition. And so, yes, so if I'm going to retweak your question, I will say the answer is yes, that it's particular, not only to Blue Rose, but to, I would say, a large portion of the overall Anderson fairy tradition. This is a particular teaching pantheon, because it should be understood that in our fairy tradition, our founder, Victor Anderson, said that we don't have our own pantheon, that we work with any gods. Basically the idea is in fairy, we will work with whoever shows up.
I like that.
So if you are working with Hecate, or you're working with Kali, or whoever you're actually working with, that's just as fairy as working with something that's established, as fairy, because it's not, the quality of the practice isn't in who you're working with, it's in what are you getting done. I would say it's more results based. And really it's about kind of establishing, I will say, friendships, with the spirits, right? And so I'm not going to be, I don't know, I'm not going to only focus on one group of friends because they're more popular. I'm going to work with who I'm friends with. And so, but this particular pantheon that I work with in those books are basically what has come to be understood as a teaching pantheon, within at least certain lineages of the Anderson fairy tradition. And I realize that's probably not a clear-cut answer, but that's as close as I can get.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear some parallels between in sort of your world and my world, because right now in my world, it's considered sort of common wisdom to reject the idea that you should work with every spirit or being in a catalog or register of spirits, and rather that you should focus on just the ones that you're attracted to or can get to actually show up and build those relationships with them, rather than, the good old days where it's like books of working with every single spirit, like from Franz Barden to Konstantinos and all those other,
right.
It's like, I worked with each one once. Yay. I mean, that is actually really good to do. I mean, don't not do that.
Oh yeah.
Why not? Like, do them each more than once.
Like, I think there's value in that, because, it shouldn't just be who you're initially attracted to, because if it's just on who you're initially attracted to, you're potentially disregarding like a lot of experience that you might have. And in fact, you might really feel like a certain spirit or deity, if you will, kind of rubs you the wrong way. That doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't work with them. That just might mean that whatever lesson they have for you is very personal, and maybe it's impacting your shadow. And so I find if you have resistance to working with a particular spirit, you might at least do your due diligence and study that spirit, and maybe even reach out and see if maybe actually working with them will change your mind and how you feel about that, because there might be something that it has for you. It was the same thing I would say. I mentioned earlier that I used to work at a metaphysical shop, and a lot of people know that I used to own a metaphysical shop, and we closed it in 2020 because of COVID. And but we sold a lot of tumbled crystals, right? And so people would be drawn to certain crystals, and I would always hear the story like, oh well, I'm drawn to rose quartz, so that means that I need rose quartz, or I'm drawn to amethyst, so that means I need amethyst. Oh, but I just can't stand hematite, and so obviously I'm not supposed to work with hematite. And I would often feel the opposite, be like, well, actually you probably have resistance to hematite because of what it represents. It probably is a lesson that you need to learn. You probably aren't comfortable with hematite because it's outside your comfort zone. But the things that are outside your comfort zone are usually the very things that are going to help us to evolve, are going to help us to, kind of round out our personalities or give us new lessons, new ideas, new perspectives. But then, then maybe, so then you work with hematite. If it still doesn't work for you, at least you tried. Right. But I think a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to work with it, so they're just not going to. And then you've basically cut off this potential life-changing experience. And so whether it's crystals or it's spirits or deities, I think that the same value holds true, that just because you might have resistance to it doesn't mean automatically that you don't need it. It might mean absolutely that you do, and it's only through trial and error. It's only through giving ourselves the opportunity to have that experience that we'll be able to determine what the truth actually is.
Well said.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So what year did the Anderson tradition begin?
Well, that's very blurry. So it
must have been the 60s.
Well, if you listen to Victor, it was before then, so Victor claimed, he was born in 1917. And so he claimed that he was first initiated when he was 9 years old. I do talk about that in my first book on the fairy tradition, Betwixt Between. I hope that it was actually a trance experience because there was a sexual element involved in his experience where he found this, old woman out in the woods, and instinctively he took off his clothes and she initiated him sexually. I'm like, dude, he was 9 years old. So that's effing creepy, if you ask me. So I do talk about that in my book. I do believe it was a trance experience.
I fucking hope so.
I would hope so. There's also the little bit of after he died, there was a particular book that was found that was set aside from the rest of his library. And this book was like a cheesy, like Pulp Fiction novel. It was called Confessions of a Warlock by Curtis Lavender. And terrible. I've skimmed it. Even skimming it, I feel like I lost brain cells. But the gist of it is that this person, it's written as fiction, but the author claims that it's real and written under a pseudonym. And this person claims a childhood initiation that is almost 100% what Victor claimed was his. And this book came out before Victor's initiation story was written down and published. And so it doesn't prove that Victor just stole this story, from somebody else, but it kind of points in that direction that he wasn't necessarily being, 100% honest, about that. So hopefully he just stole it. The one thing that I noticed that was different, because there was a lot that was identical, like the name of the goddess was the same, these brass bowls filled with herbs and all the details of the initiation were the same. But the one difference was that in the book, this Curtis Lavender person said he was 10 years old. And Victor said he was 9. So I was like, oh, okay. So he one-upped the guy, and that seems to fit with the personality as it's been described to me, of Victor Anderson, where he was a little bit of a trickster. And, I never met him. I did have one phone call with Victor about, 2+ hours, way back in the day. And it was a great phone call. And he was able to like hone in on stuff about me that I didn't share. Like I told him my name was Storm. And this is back in the day where I hadn't done anything, so nobody knew me.
Yeah.
And I told him I was Storm, and he's telling me about the wolf and why the wolf is an important symbol for me. And, and I was like, what is happening? This is crazy. So anyway, later, so after his childhood initiation, Victor claimed that he was initiated again, this time into a coven. And this would have been when he was about 15. And that coven called themselves the Harpies, and they operated in Southern Oregon. And he says that they broke up later around World War II. And then around that time is when he met the woman that was to be his wife, Cora. They claimed that they actually recognized each other when they first met, that they had actually met each other and had sex with each other prior to that on the astral. And so when they met physically, they instantly both recognized each other, and they were married 3 days later.
Wow.
And they stayed together until he died in 2001. So who's to say exactly when the fairy tradition started? Probably more proper in the 60s, I'd say, but he was kind of teaching people even before that. He moved like in the 50s at some point, he moved to San Leandro, California, which isn't too far from where I live. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he started teaching on a small scale there at that time. But there really aren't any records. There's nothing really we can point to and say, yes, at this date, at this time. So it would be the 60s that we can know for sure that he was teaching. But also the form of the fairy tradition has shifted and changed, over the years, which is what I think it should do. When I was trained, I started training first in 1992. And it was always explained to me that, yes, we have these exercises, we have these symbols in these forms, but none of that is really important. All of those things are basically tricks to kind of get us into the right frame of mind, I'll say. And so it's really about just tapping into the powers. And so if this particular exercise doesn't work for you, then we'll figure out something else that does, and then that becomes part of the tradition, right? The stuff that all fairy initiates share is so minimal. It's so minimal and so Spartan that it's like jaw-dropping, right? My little joke has been like everything would fit on one side of a 3x5 index card. And that's not even really a joke. Like that's legit. It's so minimal. Everything else is like, it's grown up around this core. And so whether it's, pantheons working with specific spirits, exercises, lore, all of that stuff is stuff that has really kind of grown up around this initiatic core, this current of energy that really is the core of the fairy tradition, is really the initiation. However, all of these things that have grown up around it, I have found to be really helpful. And not only did they help me, but I've seen them help other people as well. And so that was one of my reasons, my inspirations for writing my books, kind of trying to put things out there for teaching, because I found it to be really useful. And I love the fairy tradition so much. I want to share it with others who are likewise drawn to
You're
this
doing
work.
it tremendous honor. I mean, your prose is fabulous. It's fabulous.
Oh,
It's
thank
a delight.
you.
It's a delight to read. I'm very judgmental.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I love writing. I've always
shows,
loved
yeah.
writing. And I fancy myself a bit of an artist and a poet. But writing, even if I'm writing something like, just like the history, we're talking about like the history of fairy, how it sounds is so important to me. Like the words, like I have to actually speak them out loud, and I want to hear them. They're meant to be spoken. And especially the actual poetry that I write, everything's meant to be spoken. And so thank you. That's a tremendous compliment. I appreciate that.
I did a little Celtic Mysteries WB Yeats thing on Yeats's birthday last year, and Sean, whose LVX Files podcast you did, folks.
Yeah.
I'm not going over the same stuff as he went on before. He covered a lot. You covered a lot of personal life and politics and fascinating things with Sean. or Leiloken's Awen on LVX files on YouTube and platforms. So I wanted to make sure I didn't like duplicate any of that, which is good because I think that leaves us a lot of room to get into your magic per se and your understanding of the fairy tradition. Yeah. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. So where were we? There was a question there, I'm sure.
And this is why I won't have my gummy until we're done.
Yeah, I haven't smoked weed in 7 days, 6 days, 6 days. And I did because I was nervous. Like I was telling you, you can tell how much I respect and how famous the guest is by how fucked up I get. So like Ashen Chassan, I don't know if you know him. He's a somewhat respected up and coming author. I was blacked out by the end of the interview.
Oh my God, wow.
That's how much I respect that man. Yeah.
Respect him so much you have to be asleep. You know?
Hearing him talk Japanese is just like I could listen to that man talk Japanese.
Oh wow.
You know, and talk about ninjutsu. And then
that's
that's how I feel. He's arguably considered without argument considered one of the top evocational grimoire magicians in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
He's like, no one debates that. Everyone loves him.
That's kind of how I feel about RJ Stewart.
Amen. Let's talk about RJ Stewart.
I love RJ Stewart. And I had the opportunity, well, I've met him a couple times, and I did have the opportunity, I guess a couple years ago. It must be at least 3 years ago now, because we've been in a pandemic now for a couple of years, but going on 3.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh my God. But I had an opportunity to work with him at like a long weekend retreat in the Santa Cruz area.
Amazing.
It was him, myself, and Orion Foxwood.
Was this what years were this? Maybe what years?
This has to be 3 years ago.
4
years ago. I'll have to look at my notes. I don't get along with linear time on the best of days, so but especially now, I don't know, getting older and the pandemic, it's like everything blurs together. I'm like, I don't know. I'm fairly confident this happened in the past, but don't hold me to it. But he is just delightful. But he is, I would say, hands down, is considered to be kind of the creme de la creme of like an academic understanding of fairy folklore as translated into a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And I know that when I was in my training in Anderson Faery Witchcraft, a lot of initiates and students of our fairy tradition were also attending workshops with RJ Stewart, because RJ kind of provided more of the folkloric fairy understanding that wasn't as explored in Anderson Faery. And this is where it gets very tricky, because there isn't it working in a folkloric way, isn't universal in Anderson Faery Witchcraft. And this brings up some weird questions. The main question being, why are you called fairy tradition if you're not all working with fairies? And I have an answer for that. One is we are all working with fairies, just some of us don't know it. In fact, I think all witches are working with fairies and you just don't know it.
There's a conspiracy theory that the Enochian angels are fairies.
Yeah, well, I would say that that's true, but it depends on how you're defining fairy.
Fake news, they're angels.
But what does that mean?
Hey, this is coming from a guy who posted online multiple Enochian ritual ceremonies that I did with psilocybin to enter the sheet. So
I hear that.
I am actually exploring the possibility, but I also believe in practicing Enochian magic in a sort of purist Christian way, with my full belief in Christ as Lord and Savior.
I hear you.
And just
Why
doing
not?
These prayers. Our experiences are mediated, right? Like,
yeah,
we're in. I don't know if we're in the matrix, but we're in some matrix.
I hear what you mean.
Or we think we are. We see so little of reality.
Right. And it all comes through our personal lens,
Yeah.
our own baggage. And this is what I mean. Like, like on one level, sure, they could all be considered fairies, because like in my first book on the subject, Betwixt and Between, I talk about kind of more of the original definition of fairy, which was not what we think of today. Today we think of like, oh, a fairy is this little diminutive being, they're little Tinkerbell or pixies, and they grant wishes and they make children laugh, and oh, ha, 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 they're beautiful and whatever. But then you look at the folklore and they're like, oh my God, stay away. The fairies are dangerous. And like 90% of the magic that has to do with fairies is how to protect yourself from them. And you hear all the stories of the fairy abductions and how they could kill you. And then there's the fairy changeling, which that's a whole other conversation. But originally, the word fairy simply meant things of magic and enchantment. And it kind of had that atmospheric quality of eeriness, of mystic eeriness, right? Something is other, something is weird, it's not normal. And that was it. So under that definition, any god or spirit of the dead is fae. It is this magical othering, from normal waking consciousness, right? It's not just a particular race that lives, in primarily Ireland and Scotland and Wales. We have these stories of the little people, and sometimes they're not little, but all over the world. And there's obviously cultural differences and, differences in language and things like that. But when you strip it down, they're strikingly similar. And I think that one of the things that is the common denominators in all this is human consciousness, right? And this is why I also think that if you look at folk magic from all over the world, you get these very strikingly similar practices. Like in the United States, there's a lot, that we consider hoodoo, or conjure, depending on, which, cultural manifestation we're looking at more specifically. And they have very strikingly similar, practices to each other. But then, look at something like Scandinavian trolldom, and it's like, wow, that's like the same thing basically, but it's with different herbs because they've got different plants, but they're still using, passages from the Bible. They're still making dolls or bags, and they're stuffing them with herbs. They're using their breath. They're using their prayer, and it's like, wow, this is basically the same thing, but maybe just, they're using different color fabric, they're using some different herbs, but the practice itself is so strikingly almost the same, right? And so it at least draws from the same magical or spiritual well, we'll say, right? It's drawing from like the same source, but then it manifests through our own cultural understandings or misunderstandings in some cases.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when I talk about fairy, and I'm talking about the fairy tradition, to me, it's very nebulous, and purposely so.
Like the fae themselves.
Like the fae themselves. They're always kind of like out of the corner of your eye, right? They're always, and they're also always receding. There's all this talk about like, oh, the fairies were once with us, but now they've, basically gone into hiding, right? Now we're the dominant species perhaps, and now they've gone under the mounds, or they're in the wilderness, or they're under the earth, but they're never quite gone, but they're always on their way out, right? It's kind of just like, just outside of human awareness, just outside of our normal perception. But then those of us who work in a magical and or spiritual path, I think we develop the skill or the opportunity to be able to start to see them a little bit more head on. And I do think that, it's kind of like, that whole thing in Peter Pan, right? Clap your hands if you believe in fairies. If you believe in them, or even if you don't necessarily believe in them, but if you attune your consciousness toward them, then they start to show themselves a little bit more. And so just through any practice, and that's why I tell people, people ask me, well, how can I start to work with the fae? Well, the number one thing for me would be just make an offering, start making regular offerings, set a space where you can just have even just a few minutes to believe in them for a moment, but also be aware of what you're doing, because, they are different than humanity. And there's a reason why people felt that they were dangerous. Although I will say that I think that a lot of the talk of the Fae being dangerous, it's not that it's wrong, because they definitely are dangerous. But I think a lot of that is more fear-based than it needs to be. And I do think that a lot of it comes more from a Christian orthodoxy centered fear, where everything other than the baby Jesus is considered to be, evil and scary and of the devil, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying this so people will be cavalier, about their relationships with the Fae. I think you need to be fully present and fully respectful, because they will mess you up. If you come with disrespect, they're gonna do stuff, that's been my experience. If I forget to pay attention to them, sometimes it's kind of like, I have dogs, right? And if I forget to pay attention to my dogs, they're gonna let me know. They're up on my lap, they're making themselves known. The Fae are the same. That's when they start hiding my keys, and
you gotta pour that milk and the cream on the hills.
They get whiskey from me.
The
house Fae get whiskey.
I want to be one of the house Fae in your house.
I do a thing where if anybody ever if it's a cocktail night, we have to pour one out for the house Fae, and I have to give it to them first. Or at least I try to give it to them first. That's my practice now, is to make sure they get fed first, and then we can have our cocktail and whatever. But even just through that act, it doesn't necessarily have to be the whiskey itself, although maybe, but I think it's a type of sacrifice, right? Because, hey, that's good whiskey, or in our case, it's usually bourbon. I would drink that. I love that. I would totally have that, but I'm giving some to the Fae. I'm giving it to you guys because I want us to have a good relationship. And if I maintain that relationship, then I feel like things go well. And if I forget, because sometimes I do, I mentioned before, I'm a Pisces, I can be all over the map. That's when things go missing.
My progressed son, when I turned 40 last year, just now left Pisces for Aries. Thank God. It was not a fun 10 years, brother. From 30 to 40, my son had progressed from Aquarius to Pisces, and Jesus fucking Christ.
Oh my goodness. I'm not quite at that level of astrology. So I'm like, I'll have to talk to my astrologer friends.
My mom's an astrologer. I grew up, she was an astrologer my whole life, put me in Waldorf school, shit like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had a weird ass life. And and RJ Stewart was the first book I ever read cover to cover in one sitting, coming back from the Okanagan in British Columbia after going to a bookstore with my mom and her boyfriend, who is like a big Amwork guy, and like finding out magic was like real. And I was like, oh fuck. I saw like RJ Stewart's Celtic Magic. I'm like, yeah, game over. Like read the whole book on the drive back to Vancouver, set up my first altar, sat down and was like, oh, well, what now? But I was in.
His stuff is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean,
I burned through like probably 150, 200 Celtic Wicca, or like all the stuff, like all the books. And that's what led me to ceremonial magic and like Levi, Agrippa, and all the Golden Dawn stuff. It's because I burned through the other extant Wiccan stuff and needed more. Like I did lessons in the reclaiming tradition when I was like 13, 14, 15 with Pat Hogan in Vancouver, but like it wasn't enough. And so that's why I ended up in a Golden Dawn temple at 16.
I think it's important sometimes to look at the source material, because of course, if we're looking at like modern witchcraft, there's a lot of very heady source material that went into the creation of the modern craft. And, and I think it's important to at least familiarize ourselves, with it. Again, I'm not a scholar, but I'm a book collector like many of us, and especially now, my God, now that Matt Oren is part of our family, we've basically doubled our library. Go
get it, folks.
Yeah, that's a great book. It's
quite
the bestseller too.
Like a lot of the techniques are indistinguishable from ones in the Golden Dawn, and that's just a sign that like, if such radically different groups are coming up with the same practices, it's not because it's not because he read it and forgot it from some other thing. No, it's he came up with it because this is a real
Right.
thing. And if you actually practice this stuff, you all come to the same experiences and conclusions.
Right. And that was my point with,
Not
like,
make-believe.
folk magic across the world. The common denominator is human consciousness. We come up with these things because they're real, because they assist us in actually connecting and being able to communicate, with, I usually use the term spirits kind of universally. I'm more comfortable with spirits than I am with gods these days.
My favorite is spiritual creatures.
Oh, there you go. And I want to say, I think I'm not reclaiming, but I want to say that, like, I think the term in reclaiming now is just mysterious ones. I might be wrong about that. But I like that too, because it really doesn't answer your question. When we say, oh, these are the gods I work with, I think there's a little bit of hubris in that, because my question is, well, what constitutes a god? What constitutes a god? I mean, we could have that talk, whatever. And I'm not saying that there isn't things that constitute a god, but I think everybody kind of has their own definition. And a lot of times I feel like that definition is overtly influenced by monotheistic baggage, where, like, God is omnipotent and God is, better than you, and God is transcendent. And even if we don't think we're subscribing to all those ideas, a lot of times we are, because we were brought up in a society that kind of defined God, in that way. And so even working in witchcraft or paganism, I find a lot of people will still kind of carry that over. And so, oh, the gods are out there, they're above me, and I'm going to bow down to the gods. Well, one of the things that I had learned fairly early on in witchcraft was a witch bows to no one. And especially in fairy tradition, we were taught that includes the gods.
Yeah.
We are on equal footing with the gods. They do things that are different than us. We do things that are different from them. It needs to be a symbiotic relationship,
Yeah.
It's not
like
they're just
you. Sorry.
What's that? No, go ahead. What was that?
It's so funny, some of the parallels I keep finding. Anyway, so this might there's a core Golden Dawn practice that even when you, like, invoke or evoke a god, like, even if I invoke or summon Tahuti, you still visualize, even if you're path working, or doing evocation, you visualize yourself as taller than the being.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's like an old school original Golden Dawn teaching. So it's nice, and it's funny to see that, because it's not like it didn't come from there. It's not like it was transmitted, I don't think.
Right.
Because that information still isn't even barely published.
That's
like,
yeah.
It's not in the most of the Golden Dawn tradition is still not published.
Oh, right on. No, I didn't.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it sort of sucks, actually. But we get what we have. We get what we can. I got some unpublished stuff, but yeah, no. The lineage
that's
temples
fascinating.
are keeping it to themselves.
I like that idea. So visualizing yourself taller than the god.
Yeah.
There's a thing that I really work with my Blue Rose fairy students, where we work with the Watchers, or sometimes called the Guardians, and I will often envision them at first as, like, bigger than we are, because then we get that sense of, like, oh, there's all this power, right? And you get that sense of feeling dwarfed. But then while we're working with them, we're kind of taking in that power, and it's growing within us to the point where we end up merging with them, and we are kind of at the center of them. And so you kind of get the same thing, where at first you get the sense of, oh, it's this big power, but then it does balance out, because then it's like, well, then our power becomes just as big. And through the marriage of it, it becomes bigger than either one of us were, before. So not quite the same, but it kind of rings that like similar bell.
Yeah. Well, it's very chemical wedding,
Yeah.
Alchemical process at its core. We focus a lot in Golden Dawn on polarities. We actually even consider, like, it's less important which directions or which elements correspond to each directions, and more important what polarities we invoke into the space.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that. It's actually a really, when you think as a magician, I'm sure you can see why that's actually quite interesting.
Yeah,
It's sort of a game
absolutely.
changer when it comes to maybe ritual design in certain ways.
It's like it's kind of creating like an energetic potion, right? It's like a little of this and it marries with this, and you kind of trying to balance it out. And yeah. The only polarity that I haven't been happy with is the misunderstanding of gender polarity. And but that's its own thing, right?
Want to go there?
It's its whole other
Want to go
conversation.
there?
We can go there. I'm happy to go there. One of
I
my
had a-
upcoming books is about that. So
well, tell us about the book now that you brought it up, because I'm sure. Yeah,
sure, well,
please.
shameless plug. So I actually have two books that are coming out this year. In March, The Witch's Name comes out, but the one that I want to talk about right now is the one that comes out in May, and that's The Satyr's Kiss. And that primarily is a book. It's written for queer men, and it's primarily a way of working modern witchcraft that centers our queer male identity, and also incorporates sex magic, into the practice, because I really didn't see anything out there that was like sex magic for queer men, and even when I saw things that would include, queer people in sex magic, it was often basically telling us to visualize like the heterosexual gender polarity and just, oh, you're balancing the male and female within yourself. And I actually take some exception to that notion that that's what we need to do, because that's still enshrining a heterosexual relationship as the model by which all of us should compare ourselves to. And I only think that heterosexual people should have to do that. I don't think it's about balancing male and female necessarily within myself. It can be that at times, but that's just a metaphor. That's not everything that's going on. So, oops, I seem to have lost you. I can't hear you anymore.
Oh, sorry. I was
There you
going to
go.
say I muted for your shameless book plug, and I want to talk about satyrs with you more. I love
Oh, sure.
satyrs. I have a song about them.
Oh, nice.
But what was I going to say? I don't know. I lost it now. I got muted. I made a note. It says, based on sort of what you were saying, from the podcast you did on the LVX files, forlocks. Forlocks. And I wrote, well, you definitely are taking the power couple to the next level.
Yeah, there are four of us now. And so that was Matt's thing. It started as our shared text thread, because of course, we're all in different rooms in the house and we're all trying to coordinate, whatever, just mundane stuff. And, instead of just having all of our names at the top of our iPhone, text screen, Matt changed it to forlocks. And I just thought it was delightful. And then it got mentioned, and then that kind of took off. And somebody on Twitter was actually using it as a hashtag when they were like referring to us collectively.
Oh my God, we're going to make it happen.
And I love it. So
I've almost got,
I love it.
I've got a lot of followers on Instagram on both my channels, but I'm shadow banned to high heaven. I can't imagine why. It's not like I do fake ads for adrenochrome or something like that. It's not like I'm misbehaving at all. I'm a well-behaved transgressive now. My Golden Dawn motto means broken of chains, which I didn't realize was even a sort of an allusion to the goddess Isis in Egypt until Pantheon. Pantheon and the fires and COVID. I was, believe it or not, staying at Isis Oasis. I was teaching at Isis Oasis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like, it was a crazy 14 months. And so I did a bunch of book readings in the area, and I was going to hopefully do one at your store, but COVID. At least we got Pantheon. At least we got that. Could you imagine if we had missed that? If we had lost that, that would have really sucked.
Yeah, I sadly I didn't go to the final Pantheon in 2020 because I was actually
that was
feeling
post-COVID.
well.
Yeah, it was post-COVID.
Well, it was actually right before COVID was official. but it was
Our border was
in,
shut down. Our border was shut down. I couldn't have come back from Canada.
oh yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that. But it was before our country recognized COVID. It was like right before.
Yeah, it
And
was February 2020.
yeah.
Yeah, and
And
you were
so
there.
no, I
Yeah, you
wasn't
were.
there. No, I wasn't there.
You
No,
were
I
there.
skipped. That was the final Pantheon.
I
I
have the
skipped it.
brochure with your stuff in it.
I wasn't there. I
Are you
swear.
sure? Are you
I'm
sure? Well, I
sure.
didn't
I was
see
there
you there. I did.
2019. I was there 2019, but 2020 I decided not to go, and I was really like kind of heartbroken over it because it was the final Pantheon.
Well,
They'd
that's why
already
I didn't
decided it was
find
the
you.
final one.
That's why, yeah, that was so you didn't go to the final one. I ran around looking for you, convinced that you were there. I ran into to Matt Warren
Yeah, I was
and
supposed to
Devin.
be there,
I
and
taught
I
had a
even
nice chat with
had
Devin, but I
I
never
I
found
would
you.
have I would have
Oh
been in the
man.
program because I did have stuff that I was going to do, but then I was sick. And
Oh,
so I had to
okay.
cancel. And then I thought, it's good that I'm canceling because
You didn't
I
tell
would be
me.
that guy who is bringing a sickness, to this convention, and I would get sick at every convention anyway. That's before COVID,
Yeah.
and so I thought, I'm not going to do this. But even like 2019, oh my God, I was so sick for like a whole day. I had a fever, the whole thing. It's because, recycled air, just so many people, and sure there was like, making out time, whatever. And I'm like, oh, I need to stop. I'm getting everyone's germs. And I used to share drinks. People, somebody was talking to me about mead earlier, and the heathens would come in with their mead that they had, brewed over the year. And then everyone's sharing mead. Oh, drink, taste this one, taste this one. And I didn't even think about it. It's just like, we're sharing all these germs. Now, after COVID, I'm just like, oh no, I'm never sharing a drink again.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I'm over it.
Yeah. It's certainly in my world changed the Eucharist.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Right.
You know. Um, but it's not wine, it's Jesus' blood.
Yeah, that sounds less sanitary to me. You're not selling me on it, but okay.
Us cannibal Christians, I mean, hey, Gnostic cannibalism sounds like a good band name. One thing I was surprised in Ireland was to discover, because I did 5 years there with my Celtic band, basically touring around. Yeah, and they actually have a somewhat accepted loose equivocation between the realm of the Sidhe under the hills and Tír na nÓg, the island of the young in the west. Isn't that interesting that they actually do consider the island of Tír na nÓg in the west to be equivalent to the Sidhe under the hills where the Tuatha Dé Danann were, fled and became fairies.
That's cool.
And
That's cool.
I was fascinated to also find out that despite what some academics who are into psychedelics claim about not there being no psychedelics in Ireland and England in a long time ago. So one I read even said not until like the 50s, which is just absurd because in Donegal, in the hills of Donegal in Northern Ireland, the mushrooms grow aplenty. And the first place I did mushrooms was on the bank of the Corrib in Galway. And I learned that the Irish Gaelic, the Gaelga for magic mushrooms, for the psilocybin mushrooms, is actually Kapani Puka, which means puka hat.
Oh, okay.
And they have a very seemingly well-accepted tradition that you take the puka hats to enter into the Sidhe. And the lesson there, the trick is that I learned and that some people whispered about is that like the puka, you sort of got to shape shift and you got to shift your shape through the journey. Because as you know, it's like you said about are fairies dangerous? Like, well, not necessarily. But if you go, as you know, if you fight a mushroom trip, if you fight the journey into the Sidhe and under the hills, you can end up maybe having some dead ends or not so nice experiences.
Yeah.
So I think I want to talk to you about approach and attitude, the mental and spiritual approach to working with the Fae. And maybe I'd like to know a little bit of how you, in your experience, consider the Fae, not just theoretically, but also experientially, as I'm sure a very skilled psychic yourself.
Oh, well, hopefully I have some skill. So thank you for that.
Are you more seeing or feeling?
I'm more feeling.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
Things blur. I have seen things like even physically
Oh yeah.
have seen things, before. Mostly how it manifests to me is I feel like I'm almost seeing it. Like the feeling is so strong, I can't believe I'm not physically seeing it.
Yeah.
There's that, or I'll see
Well,
something.
that's like the grimoire magicians who claim it's a full physical apparition that anyone could see, but no one else can be there and I can't take a picture of it. That's exactly the same thing. It's like
Right.
it really looks real. You think you're seeing it. I swear it's fucking there. I'm not sure if I could take a picture of it or if someone else in the same room would see it. But
Right.
I swear to
Yeah,
God, it's
yeah.
there. And there's like knockings, and the room temperature's gone way down, and I'm freezing despite the fire on, like that sort of shit. We all know the signs of when a spirit shows up.
Right.
The more
Yeah, yeah.
sensitive you are, the less likely you are to miss the signs,
Right.
and perhaps
And I
even
and I
easier it is
and
to communicate.
I think there's something too, some about discerning patterns, or seeing like, for example, like being out in the woods, and starting to see faces like in the trees and in the leaves, and patches of sky, and whatever. I think that those things can be really powerful. It seems almost silly, when you talk about it, like, oh, I'm seeing faces in a tree, in the tree branches or whatever. It's just like, okay, what were you smoking? But it is about
DMT.
somewhere there you go. But it's about shifting your brain somehow. You could have smoked something or drank something or imbibed something,
DMT.
but just as likely, I mean, DMT is already in your brain, right? And so it's like something has shifted your consciousness. It could be breathing. It could be adjusting your body temperature. Somehow there are different things that will shift our consciousness to where we will start to see patterns emerge. And it's kind of like, it's basically the same technique as scrying.
Yeah.
Where we look into it's like every kid has done this. You go into the bathroom, you look in the mirror, Bloody Mary, right? And so
I
you
never
freak
did
yourself
that.
out. You never did
My
that.
sister and all her little friends were doing that, and I was like, no. And they're like, why not? I'm like, because I'm not fucking stupid, and I
I did
am not a
all those things.
suspicious person. I'm
I
not a
did all those
suspicious person,
things.
but like, I was having radical experiences. Like I started transcendental meditating. It was initiated into that Maharishi's cult with my family
Oh, wow.
at age 8. So like
Oh my
meditating twice a
goodness.
day, from 8 all the way up till I joined the Golden Dawn at 16, and with like Wicca and Celtic Druidry all the way in between. So like I was aware that of beings. I'd seen lots of spirits. I'd been paralyzed once when I tried to self-initiate using Donald Michael Craig's modern magic. I had the shit kicked out of me, and my Wiccan coven mates there to watch it, and it was brutal. That's when I joined a temple. It doesn't hurt to learn from people who know more than you.
Oh, I hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually what drew me to formally training,
Yeah.
eventually in the fairy tradition, because
Yeah.
I recognized, oh, there's got to be holes at the very least in my quote unquote training, because I was self-trained, I was self-taught. I mean, I read every book I could get my hands on. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I just made it up all on my own, but I never took any of it as gospel. I for some reason, I never bought into the idea that anybody had the right path. I just assumed everybody was probably had the right path for them. And if it could inspire me, if I could take something from it and it would lead me, further, I thought that was a success. But when I started working with a coven, and my first coven was just 3 of us. It was just me and these 2 young women that I knew. And we were all basically on the same level. None of us had any formal training. But what was really important is that we had an open mind and the willingness to experiment. And I found that to be some of the most powerful magic that I had done, like in my life, even still, there's stuff there that I feel was really, really important and kind of set the stage for me. Later I would train in formal traditions, but I never lost that idea that like really the power is in experimentation. Yes, we can learn certain things, guidelines, safety measures, along the way, But ultimately, once you plug into the powers that be, all bets are off, and hopefully your training will kick in, and you'll do what you need to do in the moment to navigate that moment. But ultimately, the forms of practices, that kind of falls by the wayside. They become suggestions at some point, and you just have to experiment and see, and I've always felt that the craft was an experimental path, that, nobody has all the answers. I've been teaching the craft since I was 21.
Yeah.
And, which is weird to say,
Dude, the Golden Dawn, when I was 17, had me started teaching classes of zealotors and neophytes. And these were like classes of 10, 20, 40, 50-year-olds. And I was 17.
Yeah.
So it's fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy. It's trial by fire, man. But hey, this is actually something I wanted to ask you, is like, it does seem, the more I look around, that a lot of us hardcore folks get into it very young. It's not like something we discover later in life. And a lot of this is not saying a lot of remarkable magicians, adepts, and masters don't get into it later in life. I mean, just look at the traditional Kabbalists who start at 40. I mean,
right.
You don't have to get into it young. Don't delay. Just but a lot of us do get into it when we're young. And then I look at how sort of the relationship between the older and younger magicians in the occult world, witch talk versus people with PhDs now. The amount of occultists who have PhDs now is fucking insane.
Right. Yeah.
Like, whoa. Like, we have university departments.
When did this become respectable? Yeah.
I got accepted into the Western Esotericism PhD program in 2004.
Wow. Good for you. That's awesome.
And it closed down, but like, there's still Amsterdam, and there's other ones, and there's Wiccan seminaries. Like, I did my MDiv at a Christian theological college, the seminary, but there's Wiccan ones now, which is amazing. It's just amazing. So how I think about how young people like us got into this stuff, and about the conflicted relationship, it seems, between more experienced people and the noobs who are coming up and struggling to find their place and feeling maybe not accepted, or and that causes, I think, some of them to lash out in ways that are causing a sort of a war in my world right now. Like, young people who think they know everything and are insecure and see it as a zero-sum game, and so they have to take down everyone else who doesn't agree with them, including people who have literally been doing it for like longer than they have been born.
Right. I mean, it's all kind of absurd.
It's
really,
like, it's like, how did we do this to these younger people? Did we not treat them right?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think that, yes, we didn't treat them right in some regards, because, just the larger society usually doesn't value the voices of the young, and so I think that there is already that kind of feeling that there might be a chip on the shoulder, so to speak.
They say gatekeeper all the time. I'm sure you're aware of this.
Oh yeah, whatever. But I also, what stupid stuff did we do when we were young? I mean, I did stupid stuff that I'm not going to talk about, because it wasn't recorded and on the internet at the time, and thank gods, but I did stupid stuff. And I remember, this isn't my story, but a woman that I used to work with, and I just thought this was so perfect. When she first got involved in the craft, and somebody was talking to her about Samhain, and she was brand new, and she like got all like huffed and puffed and said, well, our coven, our tradition celebrates Samhain, because she had never heard it pronounced. She had just seen it like in their books, whatever. And she thought she was correcting somebody, right? Somebody who was obviously many years her senior. And then of course, the person was really nice and, oh, okay, that's very interesting. Just kind of left it there. They weren't going to argue with her. And she thought she had, kind of won this argument, whatever. And then it was like, I don't know, like a year or two later when she realized, oh shit, I was totally made an ass of myself, and this could have been very bad. And, thank goodness the person didn't make a big deal of it, but it was like something that even years later, she'd like wake up in the middle of the night thinking about, right? And I'm sure there's all those kind of things that, you know, because I know I do that too. I'll think of something that I said to somebody 20 years ago and whatever.
God,
I'm like, oh my God, what?
20 years, 10, 20 years ago, fuck, like 2 years ago. 2 days
Well,
ago.
maybe true. I mean,
2 hours
you know,
ago, I told the guy at the Fido store to go fuck himself. You know, some guy was like behind me in a mask just saying like messed up shit. I'm like, dude, just go fuck yourself. It's like, don't like sit there, you know.
I don't
People
know. I
are
mean, but
losing their minds up
we
there.
all have done stuff, you know, that like,
Yeah.
you know, that we're not necessarily proud of. The
Dude, I
difference
toured in a Celtic
now,
band for 5 years. I know, like, like 200 shows a year. Yeah, yeah.
plenty of opportunity to fuck up, right? And
Oh yeah.
you know, but the difference now is that everything is recorded, you know, for the most part. This is all happening online.
Yeah.
And for the most part, that's not going away. You know, there is some stuff that does get lost. You know, the internet doesn't record everything all the time. There are ways to get, you know, to get things taken down, I suppose.
Oh, there's tons of
but
stuff
not
I
all
put
of
up
it.
in the early days when I was writing HTML, like in 2005, 6, 7, 8.
Oh yeah.
And I can't find that stuff at all. Like I don't have it on, you know, I lost the drive or whatever, and you know, it's gone. It's gone.
Wow. And there's nothing on
Like I had like
the
volumes of
archive.
poetries on some HTML sites I handmade, and they're all gone. Like I'm like, shit,
Oh
why did I just?
wow.
Why are the? I guess, you know, the other copies got stolen, and I thought it had a backup, but they're gone. They're just gone.
Oh wow. Yeah. So some stuff goes, but yeah, I'm amazed what things don't find their way onto the Wayback Machine, you know, the Internet Archive. But there's a
Yeah.
lot there. I mean, there's like stuff on, you know, early days of my website, faerywolf.com, you know, and I'm just like, oh man, really? That's still there, you know? Even just talking about like the graphics and everything, I'm like, oh man, that was so early internet days, you know. I started my website in 99, you know, and
Wow.
it is bad. It's even today, it's in bad need. It hasn't been updated in years. I need to get somebody on that, you know, pretty quick. But
I was
yeah.
in 99. I was working on a 786.
I don't even know what that is.
It was 486, 786 Pentium.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You know, Leisure Suit Larry days.
Right on, totally. Yeah, I started the website just because I realized that I wasn't sharing my art or my poetry because I was scared of being judged. And then when I realized that, you know, this was three years into my formal fairy training. I actually tried to do fairy training twice. You know, first started in 92 and then didn't quite work out. And then I found another teacher in 94. And so, and then in 99, after
94 was the year I memorized the longest version I could find of Child's Ballads version of Tamlin.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And that's a
so
good segue.
while you were doing that, I was like sitting in a car in North Vancouver, memorizing that ballad, waiting for Interview with the Vampire's late showing.
Oh my goodness.
After I'd seen the early showing.
Back in the day. Yeah.
So yeah. What do you consider the fairies and fairy realm to sort of be? Do you think of, like, I tend to think of things often like it's either in the tree of life terminology or in the terminology of the folklore and mythology of the country I'm focused on. So for me, that's mostly Ireland, Scotland, the Gaelic countries, you know, Isle of Man. John Michael Greer has the Welsh and Brythonic stuff covered.
Yeah.
You know, he's got that one. Good for him. I'm very glad, because that's not my cup of tea, but you know, who doesn't love Taliesin?
Right. Yeah,
what are the fairies to you? What is the fairy realm to you? Where do you see it as existing? You've mentioned it, but I wonder if you could say more. And then I'd like you to maybe give your take on the errors of the Wiccan Rede and the Threefold Law, and get into like what really is if we could talk about like the, you know, the hexing aspect of magic.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first, I feel like, you know, to define what fairy is at the very least an uphill battle. I don't think we can ultimately define it because it is so slippery. it's kind of the color that runs outside the line, to some degree. In my experience, it is very nebulous. But if I want to try to like pin it down in maybe even like pseudoscientific, terminology, I might think of them as ultra terrestrials, in the sense that, they are inhabitants of the earth, but outside of normal human perception. And I also think that they have a particular relationship to the human soul, because if you look at some of the old folklore, there was very little distinction between, a fairy, in an encounter with a fairy being, and an encounter with a ghost or the spirit of a dead person. In fact, a lot of times you'll see the fairies described, you'll hear them described as like, oh, the fair ones, or, sometimes the white ones. And, but they're not talking about like white, like I'm white, whatever, which is basically a shade of pink. They're talking about like white, like a corpse, right? And there are stories of somebody having this fairy encounter, oh, this fairy woman, and then later the person say, wait a minute though, you're actually, Susie or whatever, from the next parish over, who died, 2 months ago, right? So there's actually a lot of stories like that where, you're interacting with a fairy being, but then you realize, oh, you were actually a living human being at one point, and you died. There is this idea that perhaps, I mean, it depends on your point of view, obviously, but, the idea that fairies might be the souls of the pagan dead, and I'm not even going to put that fine a point on it, just the pagan dead. I don't necessarily know, but it kind of does feel to me that there is a cyclical relationship, between humanity and what we perceive as the Fae. And there's a lot of different types of beings that I think fall under that fairy umbrella. I've had encounters with beings that I have felt like they were almost like angels. In my first book, which was self-published, The Stars Within the Earth, I have a poem about basically a sleep paralysis experience that I had, once, where these two seemingly weird angelic beings. I don't know why I felt that they were angelic. It's not like they showed up with like, stereotypical wings or, any of that nonsense, but there was something about them that identified as angelic, but also identified as something dark. And so in my gut instinct definition of them at the time was they were these dark angelic beings that I then recognized were Fae on some level. And in this particular experience, I felt that they were brother and sister. The sister was slightly shorter than the brother. They both had beautiful golden blonde hair that was kind of curly, and they were dressed in these like flowing white robes, almost like something you'd expect out of like Greco-Roman, something. But the robes were ridiculously long. Like it wasn't physically viable that they were like walking around in this, because it was like, I don't know, reminding me of like almost like Lady Diana's wedding train. It was like so ridiculously long, like hanging out the door or whatever. It's like, how'd you even get in here? And they had weird eyes. I remember that their eyes were much larger than a human.
Yeah.
And so they kind of had that almost alien, kind of feel, to them.
The first time I worked with Midir was 2020, October 2020, did a whole month work leading up to Samhain. And Samhain, I did a sunset to sunrise ritual on 5 grams of mushrooms, regimented ritual work the entire time, using different scrying devices, doing different summonings, and everything looked physical on the shrooms.
Yeah.
And Midir, when he showed up, had massive, crazy eyes.
Yeah.
And I was seeing this with my eyes open on shrooms, because before that, hadn't actually done enough entheogenic experiments ritually with psilocybin to test these things out and to see if it just sort of activated my imagination through trippiness and a fantasy, or if it really lined up with what I was experiencing magically and creating with my tools. Like, I pulled out all the stops, all the Golden Dawn toys that are so powerful, especially doing entheogenic work, where the Golden Dawn, the colors in the Golden Dawn are very powerful on the astral plane. In the Golden Dawn, we don't actually believe colors represent symbols. We believe they don't represent energies. We believe they are energies. And it really lines up with the Rudolf Steiner education I had. I think there's a lot of truth in that plays out in entheogenic and psilocybin ritual work. But hearing you actually describe seeing a fairy the way I actually in a major operation saw a fairy king. I worked with him that whole year, put out the invocation that I co-wrote with W.B. Yeats, when we both had some spare time, when he was not like in his afterlife tryst with Maud Gonne. This year I'm working with Ailil, the next of the directional fairy kings of Ireland. So they're interesting, right? Because they came to the shores as Tuatha Danann in the boats through the mist to fight the Fomori and then the Firbolg. But then the Celts came and they went under the hills and became fairies. So they're gods who became fairies. So what are they?
Yeah, exactly.
Tricky.
It becomes very.
This is where folklore
amorphous.
becomes
very
crucial.
Nebulous. Right. And and that's that's another thing. Like, we're going back to our conversation of like, what are gods? We have this idea a lot of times. Sorry, my little dog is decided he has to go, so I'm gonna let him out really quick.
Yeah, okay.
Bye, little dog.
No problem. I'll pause there. Or I won't pause it. Pause it.
I'm back.
That was fast.
No, I was just letting him out of the room. It's like he was just I had him on my lap for a while because I don't know if you could hear him tapping across my floor. But I lost my train of thought now. Oh, that dog. Oh. What were you just saying? But I will say, because you were just talking about working with the Fairy King and kind of seeing him in that way. And thank you for sending me that invocation. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet because, of course, I was in a session right before.
Make sure wait till the peak of your gummy.
Okay, right on.
Yeah,
there you go.
Make it full screen. Put on your best quality headphones, and hey, there you go.
There you go. Okay, well,
and the sigil is done by my friend from my D&D game, which I play every week. By my friend, she's my friend's daughter who plays the game, and she's a great graphic artist from a Vancouver Film School, and she did the artwork, and I had her put the sigil drawn from the Golden Dawn Rose Cross of Midir on the head of the being. So you can literally just watch the video full screen, stare at the sigil, and actually have a cyber magic experiment. And
that's awesome.
I teach a class every Sunday. You teach cyber Zoom classes to your school of magic and magicians and folklore and folklore. So I'm very excited to also maybe touch on teaching online cyber magic, doing rituals online.
I love it. I've actually been teaching online for several years. And when I first started doing it, of course, it was in the context originally of the fairy tradition. And when I first started doing it, there was a lot of resistance from other initiates to the idea of doing any sort of long distance training.
Who were attending, or just colleagues?
No, just people in the community, because our community has been rather volatile, and we don't necessarily get along with one another. Some of the lineages are actively at war with one another. It's really boring.
It's the same shit we're in my world, bro.
It's just it's absurd. It's absurd. But it's usually based in people. It boils down to the same thing that it always is. It's fundamentalism. People decide that the way they did it is the right way. And if you're doing it any different, you must be wrong and you must be stopped. And it's crazy, man. And people get really wrapped up in it. And I've been threatened. I have been cyberbullied.
You've gotten handwritten threats.
Handwritten? No, I wouldn't say handwritten. I've gotten.
You said that on the podcast
email.
That people hand wrote a rant.
Oh, I mean, I've gotten honestly, not necessarily from fairy people, but
I would love a handwritten letter from someone. It doesn't matter what they say. I won't call I won't call the Canadian Tribunal of Human Rights for hate speech. write me a handwritten letter. I used to write letters all the time to my magical friends, one in New Zealand, one in the wilderness of Canada. My whole teenage years, handwritten letters in calligraphy, quoting Ginsberg, making up nicknames for each other, like 20, 30, 40 page letters.
Nobody does
all
that
the
anymore.
time. Yeah.
Nobody does that anymore.
They were works of art. They were so good that we would read them to our friends at the coffee shop, and everyone would just marvel at the quality of the writing and the human stories we told. It was like, the 90s version of the Kardashians.
Yeah. But now it's just on a,
thumbs up
30-second TikTok or whatever. That's what's taken that place now, is just everything on social media. No, I never got like handwritten threats from fairy people, because honestly the fairy people wouldn't want to give me samples of their handwriting. So there's that.
And now we're back to black magic.
We're back to black magic.
Let's do it. Let's fucking do it.
All right.
We got
I actually love the term. I will say I love the term black magic. I know that it gets a lot of bad rap nowadays because people conflate it with racial issues. But that's a big thing now. And I'm like, come on, that's not what we're talking about here. To me, the idea of like black magic.
I thought that was just
in terms
a joke.
of, no, seriously not. In fact, I've brought it up before. I've been shouted down. Like I was teaching an event, and I mentioned this great quote. I think it's a great quote from the late Victor Anderson. And the quote is, "White magic is poetry. Black magic is anything that actually works." And I love that quote. And but I mentioned this, and this woman got so bent out of shape, and this is racism and blah blah blah. And I tried to explain, this has nothing to do with like black people. This is, black magic is different. Yes, there has been a racial element for some people, because a lot of times white people would look at the spirituality of black and brown people and be scared of it. And then that becomes black magic. But there's a lot more that was black magic than just what black and brown people were doing. It was anything that was hidden. It was anything that, purported to be tapping into the hidden secrets of nature and trying to manifest our will, sorcery, if you will. And I think that black magic, like the term black, I see it is very similar to like the term black that we use for the term black hole. It's not, you don't see it directly. It's hidden. It's the hidden nature. It's like the occult. That's what it means. Occult means hidden.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so to me, it's the same thing. So black magic is really just, it's the hidden nature of nature. It is our way of tapping into something that is hidden, that is usually beyond our normal perception. And now we're tapping into that and hopefully causing change. So I actually love the term black magic, the black arts, the dark arts, all of it.
It's an interesting thing to read your perspectives on hexes and jinxes and curses. I mean, because in black magic, in my tradition, means magic designed to hurt someone else, especially against their will. And I think that it's fair to say that that's a accurate traditional definition.
Yeah, I would say so.
I mean, it's very much in line. Like if we go all the way back, when I was in 2019 doing my European lecture tour, I got to go to a lecture at the British Library where this scholar on his PhD thesis had studied the addition of this little Assyrian tablet chunk that had gotten discovered and attached to a larger piece that allowed a new interpretation. And it was on the laws about witchcraft and magic and sorcery. And what it clarified was that witchcraft was illegal because it was designed to hurt someone else. Now, of course, it's the Assyrian word for witchcraft, but that's like the closest equivalent we have.
Yeah.
And it was magic designed to hurt. And it was fascinating to hear because, not only has this stuff been around forever, we had a hiccup post-Enlightenment, but not that big a hiccup. If you actually read all the grimoires and the literature and orders, like Rosicrucians that were around that whole period, it's like, oh no, magic was alive and well. It was just like kings and queens and their ministers that were actually doing it. Like the guy who ran England for a while James I was out of town was the main Enochian practitioner of his day. And he was the military dude who ran England for a while. You know what he was doing every night in the palace.
Right.
Right, because he had all John Dee's stuff. He was the guy in that period.
Well, you think about those types of magical systems too, that tend to be, on one level, kind of complicated and heady and rely on a lot of study and maybe even objects that are hard to come by. And that's obviously set apart from things that are more like primal or shamanistic, in nature, where, it's more the land, and working with the land, as opposed to, more mental or even celestial, type of magic. But they all kind of, the Venn diagram is there. They all come together, at some point, the center of all magic. But magic is pretty diverse. It's as diverse as life. Magic is life, to some degree. And, there's a lot of different life forms on this planet. And, on one level, they would all have their own way of tapping into that mysterious force that really is the consciousness of the universe, we'll say. If you want to call that God or goddess or whatever, I don't think it matters what we call it.
Have you looked at the Book of Oberon at all?
We have it. I've like skimmed through it, but
it's got one of the best overall descriptions of any grimoire, apparently, of the Demon Kings.
Oh, wow.
Who, of course, traditionally you would bind them to yourself in the Abramelin after contacting your holy guardian angel. But in the Book of Magic, which is the proper name for the Book of Oberon, So what I've been doing with Yeats's Celtic Mysteries is adapting the evocations. There's 2 of them in there for Oberon, to use them with the Irish gods and fairy kings, who are also the spirits. And that's what I've been working on. I mean, I did the first series, 2 years of operations from 98 to 99. And then just, here and there over the years. Pantheon was me announcing it, like kicking it off. Then COVID happened. So it's like no initiations, nothing's happened except me doing the writing. If like, I think things are going to change. England just opened up entirely, like across the board. COVID's over in England. And like, we're in the Commonwealth. So hopefully that'll change, because they have not. I busted ass from November to December to book 24 gigs this year, $300 a gig, 24 gigs. Then the government at Christmas put a new law in, canceling all of them, canceling everything, canceling Christmas, canceling New Year's. Doesn't matter if you're vaxxed or unvaxxed, just canceled. So hopefully, since we're in the Commonwealth, we'll follow England rather soon. And we're like, everyone's fucking vaccinated. The whole fucking country's vaccinated. Like, America sort of stands out in that respect. But I don't and I'm not like pro or anti. I'm just like, I trust your doctor, like,
Oh yeah, definitely
I'm a trust your doctor guy.
Because there are some people that can't, for good legitimate reasons, medical reasons, can't get
Offspring. So fired their drummer. Offspring. You remember the Offspring?
Yeah.
They fired their drummer because he has that one disease that's like absolutely not.
Oh, see,
like that. I forget the name because it's a really weird name, but like he has it, and there's a couple athletes that had it. It's like you'll die if you die right away. And they fired him. He had to get fired.
That
sucks.
Yeah, that's not cool.
Yeah. Anyway,
it's just sad, because I know a lot of people will claim that they have, medical stuff when they don't, and so it's like ruining it for everybody. It's kind of like the people that have like
doctors don't.
They have like a service dog. Right. And it's like, that is not a service dog. You're ruining it for the people that actually need a service dog. Right. That was another thing at Pantheon that actually kind of annoyed me, was people showing up with fake service dogs. And some of you out there might know who I'm talking about, but there was a couple people in particular that showed up with their dogs and with a little vest on and everything. It's like, that is not a service dog. You can tell by how it's acting that it's not trained. And that is not a good thing. And, I don't know why I'm talking about service dogs now. See, Pisces brain, woo.
So one of the reasons I think I had no problem taking a vow when I was initiated into the Golden Dawn against doing magic to hurt people was because of, reading the Witches Bible complete, because of Gavin and Yvonne Frost, Scott Cunningham, all those people, brainwashing me with the Wiccan read
Right.
Gerald Gardner, Alexander's. I read everything. There wasn't, you could read everything pretty quickly actually in those days. Like literally,
Oh
like
yeah, totally.
you had like,
There
you
wasn't
know,
that much.
a parent who was guilty from getting a divorce, you were good. You got all the books you wanted. And it didn't take that long to read them all, which is why, you know, I ended up having to bite the bullet and join a group, even though I very well knew the problems that would come with human interaction, for lack of a better word. Like people, it's people, right? Like we learn in kindergarten that shit's a little fucked up. Preschool. um so yeah, you could get through all of that literature rather quickly in those days. What was the
Yeah.
point of that? What we were saying?
But the thing with, like, you were mentioning like the threefold law and like the Wick and
Yes,
read,
that
and,
was drilled
you
into
know,
me. And your book is and I always suspected, I always felt it was fishy. But because I then, you know, at 16 joined the Golden Dawn, I sort of stopped reading Wicca stuff. Like, you know, I
right.
still bought Scott Cunningham's book on Kahuna. And, you know, I would read the odd book. Like Gavin and Fron Frost to this day are the changed my life with astral travel. Like I can't believe it. Like, you know, I don't limit myself when it comes to the mastery of magic.
Mhm.
You know, I love Voodoo, but you were the first one I'd ever read. Maybe I've been out of touch to sort of discount this Wiccan read and the Law of Three and the this will come back to you threefold. And you, yeah,
Mm. Well, thank you. Well,
so you did the
I can't
research.
imagine I can't imagine I'd be the first person to say that, and even in like a
No,
modern witchcraft sense.
I'm just saying I've been out of touch. So this is the first
Right.
time I've encountered it.
Yeah, well, you know, I will say that in terms of my training in the fairy tradition, that was very clear that in fairy we didn't subscribe to the Wiccan read because we didn't see ourselves as Wiccan. And this gets into how are we defining this? Because I know the academic definition of Wicca encapsulates all of the modern craft movement, you know, and that's how the word is used in academia. You know, Wicca is not just the initiatory path of Wicca, which is basically Gardnerian, Alexandrian, and its offshoots. But on an academic sense, Wicca is all of modern witchcraft. Okay, I don't really agree, you know, with that. I do feel like
Yeah.
Wicca is Wicca, and obviously there's to use a broad brush, there would be like two basic forms of Wicca, right? There'd be like traditional initiatory Wicca, which is alive and well, despite what people may claim on the internet. I keep hearing people say, well, you don't want this to happen to, you know, just like it happened to Wicca, you know, Wicca got ruined. No, Wicca did not get ruined. It still exists. It's still there. You know, calm your tits. It's fine. There's also public Wicca, which is more eclectic. And I think that has a lot to offer too, you know, but you're right. So with the threefold law, that was not something that's part of the fairy tradition really at all. And when I say that, I want to be careful because anybody in fairy can adopt whatever they want, you know, whatever. And so I know that there's at least one lineage of fairy tradition that does use the threefold law. How do I know this? Because this person tried to get me to agree to use the threefold law in my stuff. I was like, why do you even care? I don't believe in it.
Do you want to describe
But
the threefold law to all the ceremonial magicians
well,
on my
I'll do my best. Let me talk about,
for all those ones who forgot?
there's two, I want to say that when we say the threefold law, there's really two different things that are being talked about. And there is the idea that everything you do, whether it's good or bad, is going to go out there in the world and then it's going to come back on you times 3, right? That's the public pop culture understanding, I would say, of the threefold law, you know, which I don't agree with, because in that regard, I agree with Newtonian law. You know, everything has an equal and opposite reaction, right? But from what I've heard from my Gardnerian friends is that's not exactly what the threefold law is supposed to be talking about. Now, not being Gardnerian, I can't really speak to that directly, but what I can gather, what I assume based on conversations, is that the real meaning of the threefold law is that it's going to, whatever you put out in the universe is going to affect you on 3 different levels. And that might mean body, mind, and spirit. If I was to adopt that into a more fairy tradition witchcraft understanding, we work with a model called the three souls. And so I might then say, oh yeah, everything I put out in the world is going to affect my three souls. Okay, I could accept that. But the idea that I'm putting energy out in the world and somehow it's being magnified 300% and now coming back to me is frankly absurd.
Yeah.
But I also think that it served a point in modern witchcraft history toward making witchcraft more palatable to the masses in terms of not being afraid of witches, because if people were afraid of witches, they were more likely to persecute and, hurt witches.
Yeah, it seems like you believe that, in fact, point of fact, to call it like it is, that 20th century witchcraft authors sometimes flat out lied in the form of just for protection.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it was lying. I think sometimes it was them believing it because their own teachers taught them that. And so they had no reason to disbelieve it. But I feel the same way. The same thing was present in views of sexuality. When I was a kid and I was first reading books on the craft, I remember reading a Witch's Bible Complete and them just asserting that, witches don't do orgies. We don't do this. We're accused of all this stuff. We're accused of having, wanton sex and, sex parties and all this stuff. And we don't do that, and they were very prim and proper in how they said they would do, even like with sex magic.
Like some big grove with an owl statue.
Right, there you go. You're talking about like the Bohemian Grove. There you go.
Like you dirty Wiccans, and they've been doing it since Mark Twain.
Right, I know, right? But part of that could be also that's how they were taught. So the whole thing of, oh yes, well, in the case where we're actually going to do like the sacred marriage, the great rite, where the priest and the priestess have ritual sex. In those books, they would talk about, yes, they're going to do that, but if they're going to do that privately in the other room, or at the most scandalous I would get from the books of the time was somebody, I can't remember what book it was, but the priest and the priestess apparently were described as having sex in the middle of the circle, but everyone turned their backs. So no one was watching them. And somehow that was supposed to make it better or make it less scandalous or whatever. Yeah. And I'm like, that's just somebody's kink right there. I don't know. That's just, that's what's
I've never done anything like that in any ritual or magical setting at all, outside of like Pantheon.
Pantheon was rife with that, right? I've certainly worked sex magic in different ways. I talk about that quite frankly in my upcoming book, The Satyr's Kiss, where I do talk about sex magic rituals that involve either just individual or couples or groups. And I thought that was important to put out there because this stuff exists, it's real. And I also know other groups do that. I have a very limited connection to a tradition called the Minoan Brotherhood. And from my limited exposure there, there's a lot of sex magic that happens, even group sex magic, and there's an established tradition that has been around for, longer than I've been alive, so these things happen, but people don't really talk about it. When they talk about it, they like to kind of whitewash it. And that's what I felt even as a kid reading these books. I thought, no, there's something else, because I just instinctively knew, even before I was sexually active, that sexuality was so powerful, and that there was something about the carnality of the craft that was so potent and necessary. And yet the books at the time really downplayed that, even if they discussed it at all, which usually wasn't. It was all very whitewashed and made prim and proper. And I think it was for public consumption, because, most people wouldn't have been able to really accept that, at the time. But I like to think that we're living in a space now and a time now where we can be more frank about what we're doing and what we think is important. And that's why I wrote The Satyr's Kiss, because I felt that there needed to be something out there that actually affirmed this, that was like, no, we're going to do this. And yeah, it's hot. We're going to have hot sex. And that doesn't mean it's any less important or spiritual or magical. We can have hot spiritual magical sex. We can have hot spiritual magical group sex, and that's okay. And if you don't want to, that's okay too. And so here's alternatives. Here's how you can do these things in a non-sexual way, right? So I wanted that to be out there. I didn't want to force sexuality on anybody, but I wanted to provide an opportunity for people to incorporate their full sexual being into their craft, because we shouldn't be holding anything back, from our magical work. We need to just put ourselves fully in our work. And if it's
Amen.
Sexy and hot, that's great. If it's silly and ridiculous, that's great too. Sometimes both together, that's fine. We can have hot, silly, ridiculous sex, and that's okay. That's magical too. But again, the books at the time, I think, were more focused on how do we get the public to not be scared of us. And this is also one of the reasons why I think that,
well, it's still a struggle today.
It's still a struggle today.
If you can be in a university and be like, well, I'm into Reiki, but if you're like, I'm a Solomonic magician, you might not get tenure. Let's be honest.
No, I hear you. And I'm no means saying
strange how we're only
that.
Selectively tolerant. It's kind of it's actually kind of parallel in a weird way to the whole Asian thing of the universities right now. It's that's a problem, because they're actually discriminating against for being better than everyone else. You must know about that.
I don't know.
You don't know about the Harvard not admitting Asians? Oh my God, it's crazy.
No.
Oh, dude, sorry.
Oh my God, no.
It's crazy.
I've never heard of that.
Oh, you don't even know. We're all in bubbles these days. Hey, yeah. So because they're not counted as people of color because their stats are too high across the board. So they're actually let in less than whites and people of color and anyone. They're the bottom of the rung for getting in.
Oh my God!
Because their stats are because if it was pure meritocratically, it would be like all Asians.
Wow!
They just work harder than all of us.
I'm both surprised and not surprised at the same time.
I'm slightly. It's
terrible.
It's not even really an exaggeration. It's check it out. It's pretty fucking crazy, especially.
Oh man, that is just. I was not expecting that. But,
I know. I'm so happy. It's sort of funny. It's trippy for me. Well, I guess I'm so in the university world, but not everyone is, right? So yeah, that's a thing.
Holy man,
I feel so bad for them because they're work. I know what it is to study my ass off and do really well. So if someone's doing the best, and to know that they're held back because they're doing the best, that's gotta hurt. That's gotta suck so much.
That is as if our society wasn't fucked up enough.
You know who did a good bit on that was Hassan Minhaj on Netflix, actually, in his little comedy social issue show. He got his show is super successful, and he's an Indian comedian, right? Hassan Minhaj. Oh, his special Homecoming King is one of the finest performances of anything on stage I've ever seen.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah, amazing. And his show, after even though it was skyrocketing in popularity, got taken down after he did a scathing bit on Saudi Arabia.
Oh man.
Who, of course, you can't attack Saudi Arabia if you're in the US.
Yeah,
you're canceled. You're canceled. Don't you know that? It's the most open secret in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, gosh, I kind of suspected that just after 9/11, when it was hello, they're the ones that attacked us, so we're going to attack somebody else. We're not actually going to address the problem. We're going to turn over here and attack somebody else.
I was watching the towers fall 8 a.m. at Corpus Christi College, and then it was let's attack Iraq, and it was what is going on? And that's when I started reconsidering the holographic universe and simulation theory and all that sort of stuff. I started being open to things. Still took me a few years. I was 24 before I took my first toke of weed, and 30 or 25 before I explored psychedelics in Ireland and got into the entheogenic realms. But our reality, brother, it is not what we think it is. And that's probably because we see less than 5% of it, right? And that's why there's fairy realms like the she
Right.
and these realms. Can you maybe we don't have much time left, and I appreciate you coming on, but maybe we can just bang a few things out of the park.
Yeah, absolutely.
About your perspective, because I have a lot of listeners who are in love with everything we're talking about. What would you say is your favorite technique for entering the fairy realm?
My favorite technique for
And
entering the fairy realm. Well, one of my early techniques that I think
because you have a lot
really
in your book,
effective.
there's like your book is chock full of techniques.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I tried to make it
it
practical.
Yeah,
Instead of just, me talking about stuff and not,
it's a perfect
following
balance.
through. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
it's got a lot of meat, a lot of meat.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's just, wow. That's a lot of good vibes. I really appreciate it. I loved working on that book. And one of my favorite techniques that really anybody can do, and this was something that was part of my fairy witchcraft training, was we actually went to a park, not like a little suburban park, but we went to like Tilden Park, which is in Berkeley, and it's, a lot of trees, and you can feel like you're getting away from people, right? It's out of, where people are living and all that. So it's a little bit more, there's wildlife and, and everything. So the technique was to go to some wild-ish place and before sunset, and then to find a place where you could like sit maybe at the base of a tree and away from people. So, and you shouldn't hear people, you shouldn't see people, and you're just going to sit there and you're just going to be quiet while the sun is setting. And the idea is, if you're totally quiet, you're not listening to music, you're not listening to a podcast, anything, you're just listening to the sound of the woods, and you're allowing yourself just over time to slowly slip into trance. And it kind of matches the sun. As the sun is creeping down underneath the horizon, our consciousness will match, and so our consciousness starts to set like the sun, and we start going down within. And then after it's dark, then we just have this period where we're sitting in darkness in the woods, and we're just being very open, very sensitive to what we're hearing, paying attention to the sound of the breeze moving through the trees, through cracking twigs, maybe animals, moving around. And this, I have found, is a really simple way of allowing our consciousness just to make that shift into being able to start to perceive what we might think of as, quote unquote, the other world. And this is where you might start to
do you think it's the same as the astral plane?
I don't know. I here's the thing. I do, and
tough,
I don't.
Right? It's tough, right?
And because it is tough, because again, people have different definitions for what those mean. And I will admit I'm fairly loose with them, because it's a mystery to me, and I'm not ever going to claim I know all the answers, right? I'm going to share what my experience is and what I believe based on my experience, but I think that's what everybody needs to do.
Life is more fun when you're loose.
It's more fun when you're loose. Exactly. Yeah, that's true though. It's certainly more effective. You are able to let go of what you believed to be true. And now you're simply in the full presence of whatever the experience actually is. Now, after the experience is over, you could judge it till the cows come home and try to define it and all of that. But while you're having the experience, hopefully we're not engaging through that ego mind, just let it happen. One of the things that we talk about in our Black Rose Witchcraft course is that we do work with, gods. We actually work with the text of Leland's Aradia as kind of our sacred text, for that particular course. But one of the things that I say is it's important to approach the gods as a capital M mystery. And so that means even if you think what the nature of the gods is, it's important while you're having these particular experiences, at least in the context of this course, to let all that just fly out the window. So while you're having the experience with this being, try not to think about what they are. Try not to define them in the moment. Just allow the experience to happen. Surrender to it. Allow it to move through you and see how it feels. And then when you're done, you come back to normal consciousness. You could judge it. You could define it, all you want to. But if you're in the moment having that experience and you're not trying to define it in the moment, you're much more likely to have a fuller, richer experience. And it's far more likely to teach you something surprising. Because if we think we know all the answers, we go into it thinking we know all the answers, then you're not going to find anything because you're closed off.
Yeah, it really is that important to allow ourselves to interact with spirits through every aspect of our consciousness and reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like it's so easy
Absolutely.
to think that I need to hear or see or feel them. Whereas, they'll talk to you especially after you contact them in a strong and potent way. They might show up and interact with you, or the things they've said might sort of seep in later, it feels like sometimes,
Or if we're doing, let's say we're doing a ritual to contact a particular being, we might do the ritual successfully. We might even feel that their presence was there, but maybe we don't get the quote unquote answers that we wanted in the moment.
Oh yeah. The first time I evoked Midir, he was not happy. And I kept him there for hours and hours just to get him to transmit a sigil by which I could communicate with him more easily next time. But he was not pleased. He was pissed off the whole time.
Oh, wow.
And sometimes sort of just thought it was funny, but it's I kept trying to ask questions, do some automatic writing as well. And I was having a full visual, manifestational experience after it was, the first operation itself was just 5. And then a few weeks later I did 12, and we haven't stopped, as you can see from the YouTube video. Even one night I got stoned and made a little YouTube video with some psychedelic color changes, and I tweaked the vocal. I like to show people invocations just straight, just like a good quality mic, and just this is how it is naturally, because I think there's a lot to hearing it raw, right? But if you're stoned some night, never hurts to break out the multi-track, do some mixing, throw on some verbs and compression.
There you go.
And then put a little psychedelic video behind it, right? Hey, it's a fun thing.
There's also that part of, a good ritual often has an element of the dramatic, because Crucial. It is about how we're feeling.
It's why they're called psychodramas.
Right, exactly. It's about opening up your senses, and allowing yourself to become affected, but we spend so much time in normal waking consciousness trying desperately to be unaffected by the world, even though we still are, but we're trying so hard. It's like we're white knuckling our way through. Ritual is important because it can help us to let go, and letting go is not an easy thing. Anyone who's done any of those silly corporate bonding experiences, those exercises, there's a whole thing about you hold onto the pencil when you make a fist.
Hey man,
you count for a minute, right? And then you got to let go, and you can't let go, right? Because letting go is hard.
It is hard. It is very hard. Yeah. There's a there's a movement in grimoire magicians these days, where some of them, like Adley Nichols, are purposefully not going into any trance states, leaving their room lights on and everything, and just calling the spirits to the extent that and they're letting their critical mind go. People are like, oh, but you're still focusing your mind and hushing your critical mind. They're like, no, I let it just go. I want to see if the spirits show up in all of that full thing. And so as a result, it seems like they're getting some very physical and radical appearances and manifestations. It's a fun idea. It's actually, why not? Especially with Solomonic magic, if you're observing purification times and doing everything properly, that's a powerful sympathy, right? That's inclined to make things happen. I mean, we've all seen stuff.
I can see where there might be a prejudice against that idea, because of course it goes against what people have often been taught, I will admit, I preferred, I want to go in my dark room. I want to light a candle.
Oh yeah.
whatever. And it sets the stage, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right way to do it. We touched on like cyber magic and teaching long distance earlier, and we
Oh
didn't really
yeah.
get into it. But I wanted to say that I didn't think that that was something that was viable
I
before
didn't think it
until
was
I did
viable.
it.
We tried it out one time, and Sean was in the class, and I did a basic heptarchial evocation, Enochian operation, and it was so powerful. Afterwards, universally, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna keep doing this. This is
Yeah.
crazy." Like, it's
Yeah.
definitely not the same as being in person, but it's definitely not nothing. It's actually quite a lot. So
Right. It's not the same, but it's not even necessarily less than. It's different. There are
different.
some things that are hard to approximate, whatever, but you can make adjustments. But my first experience was I was invited to a teleconference ritual, like on the phone. And I thought, oh, what a lark, I'll do it, right? And which was kind of hubris on my end. And luckily I didn't say anything to that effect, but I went there and I just thought, oh, this would be funny. And then when the ritual started, I felt it. And pretty much just the same as if the circle was being cast in my room, physically. I was like, I feel this. It shifted my consciousness in the way it needed to happen. And so that's what taught me, oh, this can be done long distance. And so fairly early on, I started experimenting with teaching the fairy tradition long distance. And in those days, I used Skype. And what I realized was we still can have a shared space together. It's just that space is not physical.
Mhm.
And if we claim to believe in the magic that we do, if I believe that I can cast a spell that could potentially alter the world or change something in the manifest world, why would I then think that doing a class over Skype or now Zoom, would automatically be ineffective?
Yeah.
I think the resistance I got was simply people hadn't considered it before.
Yeah.
And people often will consider that their learned experience is the baseline, for everybody else. But I got a lot of flack. I got a lot of resistance to it, but I've been doing it for years. So when COVID happened, I
You
had already
knew.
been doing this
Oh,
for
you're
several
lucky. Yeah.
years. And so I didn't have to do any adjustments. It was just, that's for me, it's normal.
I didn't even have the guts to try it for the first year of COVID, and I'm glad I did. Yeah, I think the way to think about it, I've learned from doing it now every month with my weekly class, is, and we do either basically Enochian purist, like John D style, just Christian prayers, no LBRP, no banishing rituals, nothing like that, just all of these prayers, the conjuration, the Enochian calls, and then the operation. And we do that, or we do Celtic fairies. It's a
Right
very
on, like you
interesting
do.
mix. That's yeah.
That's awesome.
We're gonna
I
get
love
into
it.
some Shem angels this year, but yeah, it's like, hey, it's a good mix. That's a good, you can't really go, yeah, whatever. It's been such an
That's
honor having
awesome.
you on, brother. I'm so glad that we didn't get to any of my questions. Everything we talked about was way more interesting than my questions. Though the quotes in your books I'd marked are excellent. People should just buy your book. They should just go get your book. And
I hope they
Betwixt and
do.
Between is the first one if you're a beginner. And does the
Yes.
code Magister still work?
Yes.
So
Yes.
you can
So
get a month free at your online School of Witchcraft and Wizardry using the code Magister.
you can. Yeah. If
You
you
want
go
to
to
fill in the blank?
go to modernwitchuniversity.com. And that's where we house all of our online classes. But the big one, our big class is Black Rose Witchcraft. And that is roughly a year. It could be longer because it's self-paced, but it won't be less than a year. How it works is every 7 days, the next lesson will unlock, and there's 52 lessons. And we also have a very active Discord server. And so you would get the invite and the passwords for that, in your first lesson. And then, so we've got close to 250 people on the Discord server who are, at various stages in the course. And we've got people who have been initiated and are now serving as mentors,
Yeah,
so there's a lot going on.
You've had like close to 1,000 people go through your school so far, eh?
Yeah. So Black Rose alone has had about 750 people, who have signed up. And that's not all of them have completed the course. I do find that some people realize, oh, this is actually work.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't just, oh, I get a lesson and I get to put this in my book of shadows and not worry about it.
Don't get me started.
There's work involved, and then you have to share what your experience was, and in order to get the initiation, which is basically
if you don't do the stuff
journey.
in between the classes, it's just not going to work. Nothing's going to
it just won't work. You'll get out of it what you put in. You know, and that's how life works, and
like any relationship,
how the craft works. Exactly, like any relationship. You know, if you show up and do the work, then the work will work on you. And that's what it's about. It's not about just accumulating knowledge. It's about lived experience. You know, accumulating knowledge, whatever. There's books for that, and you can read books, but a book isn't going to initiate you into the craft. It could give you the steps that you need in order to maybe do those things on your own, you know, but
my dear friend,
it's not the same.
My dear friend who took me to the Pantheon was Marilyn Motherbear. Who's, you know, BFFs with Oberon and that whole crew up the mountain.
Right on.
Yeah, you know them. And she would always say to me, she was 82 then, and she's older now, but she would always say the mystery is the experience. And it's true. I like the Greek mysterion, this idea it's just something you participate in it. And
right.
Yeah, she was the one who ordained me at ISIS with High Archpriestess Arissa Victor, if you ever met Granny Rainbow over the years.
Oh, I haven't, but that sounds delightful.
Can I leave you with one little fun thing? So in grade 8, we did Macbeth, and you could write your favorite 3 picks. And I wrote which 1, which 2, which 3, because I was deep into Cunningham as well as Don Craig's Modern Magic. And the teacher said no and denied all 3 of my top picks. I said, why? She's like, because witches are only girls. And so she cast me as Hecate.
Huh? Okay.
I thought you'd appreciate that little story. I
don't understand that, but that is crazy to me. I mean, first of all,
I got to experience my first accidental god form on stage.
There you go. Well, there's that
channeling,
accidental god form.
Yeah,
but also,
don't you love it? Don't you love it? That's Waldorf school logic for you.
Gender, like forcing gender roles. You know,
it was the early 90s.
We need to be done with that. We need to be done with that.
You can't be a witch because you're not a girl, but you can be a goddess. It was so confusing. No wonder I turned out this way.
You can be it all. Have it all, man.
Hey, I would have asked to be Hecate if I thought they'd cast me as a goddess, but Macbeth was played by a girl and I played Hecate. Maybe we were just actually ahead of our time.
I don't even understand.
They were advanced ahead of their time.
There you go. I get, but that's so weird about you can't be the witch though. Like,
yeah, I know.
Literally, weren't they described as having beards too? I'm like, come on.
I mean, I didn't have one when I was 13, but anyway, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a real treat. I hope we can talk again.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, no, I've
had a blast.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Storm. And
my pleasure.
My best wishes to your husband and to Devin and to Matt. And, maybe we'll do a roundtable sometime in the future. That would be cool to talk about, maybe, I don't know, psychism in an in-depth way. There's not enough of that out there, I think,
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why also Matt's book has done so well, is it really hit that sweet spot, that's so necessary.
I lucked out.
Psychic development end of things, I think, is so necessary.
I think I got a lot from the books that were around when I was young, but I got so much out of the Golden Dawn training. And to see Matt put out a book that brings what I consider equivalent to like Golden Dawn psychic development techniques to the general public in a more friendly way that's less, Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Awesome.
It is. I think it's that's why I have it. So I recommend it. So blessings to all of you.
Thank you. I will certainly let him know too. That's high praise. Thank you.
Anyway. All right. Well, hit record. Stop.